I let him file first. That was the part nobody understood. Not my sister, who thought I was in shock. Not my neighbor across the cul-de-sac, who brought over banana bread and pity at the same time. And definitely not my husband, Daniel Mercer, who stood in our kitchen with one hand wrapped around a glass of ice water, like he was rehearsing grief for an audience he hadn't met yet. He thought filing first meant he controlled the story. He thought the person who rushed to the courthouse got to frame the marriage, frame the house, frame the money, frame me. And for a few days, I let him believe that. The first sign that he was already counting my defeat came before the papers were even served. It came in the form of a bank alert at 6:14 a.m. on a Wednesday. A soft buzz on my phone while the sky over Bellevue was still gray and cold and undecided. I opened my eyes, saw the notification, and felt something inside me go still. Home equity line inquiry received. Not completed. Not approved. Received. Our house on Alder Ridge Drive had never had a HELOC. We had talked about it once, years ago, when Daniel wanted to unlock some flexibility for a consulting venture that somehow required designer office furniture before it required revenue. I said no, then, calmly, clearly. No debt against the house. Not unless both of us sat in the room, looked a loan officer in the eye, and decided together. So when I saw that alert, before sunrise, with Daniel asleep beside me, one arm thrown over his forehead like a man exhausted from honesty, I knew two things at once. He was moving against the house, and he thought I still trusted the pace of our marriage enough not to look closely. By 7:10, I was downstairs making coffee with hands that looked steadier than they felt. The machine hissed. The heating vent clicked on. Through the back windows, our yard still looked like the yard of a normal family. Frost on the grass. Soccer net tipped on its side. My daughter Ellie's chalk stars faint on the patio. Normal is the cruelest costume a life can wear when it's already broken underneath. Daniel came down in running clothes he hadn't actually run in for months. He kissed the side of my head, asked if there was any coffee left, asked if I'd seen his Navy folder. Navy folder. There it was. Not even fear, not even caution, just routine. Like deception had become household furniture. I handed him a mug and said, "On the dining table, I think." He smiled. "What would I do without you?" The answer rose to my tongue so fast it almost scared me. You'd miss deadlines, forget passwords, bounce payments, lose your cufflinks, file the wrong forms, pretend confusion when the truth cornered you. Instead, I said, "Probably something expensive." He laughed like I was charming. That laugh used to undo me. In the beginning, Daniel had the kind of confidence that made every room feel warmer. He was handsome in a polished, East Coast private school way, clean haircut, expensive watch, voice always half a note lower than it needed to be. He knew how to look at someone and make them feel chosen. Back when we met in Chicago, I mistook that for depth. 13 years later, I knew better. Depth listens. Depth stays. Depth doesn't quietly test whether it can borrow against your home before telling you the marriage is over. He left at 7:42 with the Navy folder tucked under his arm. At 7:51, I called the bank from the laundry room so the kids wouldn't hear me. The woman who answered had the kind voice of someone who spends her day catching pieces of other people's disasters. She verified my identity, confirmed there had been an inquiry connected to our property, then went quiet in the careful way professionals do when they know the next sentence matters. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "I can't discuss a pending application in detail. without both parties or proper authorization. But I can tell you this. If you have concerns about unauthorized borrowing against jointly titled property, you should contact your title company and family law counsel immediately. Family law counsel. The phrase hit harder than it should have because it meant my private suspicions had already crossed into a category with forms and billing rates and legal consequences. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the detergent shelf until the labels blurred. Then I did the most important thing I would do that week. I did not confront him. That's the mistake people imagine they'd never make. They think strength looks like immediate fire. A slammed phone on the counter, a name shouted across the room, a demand for explanation before dinner. But anger is loud, and loud people reveal what they know. Quiet people get documents. So I called a family attorney my friend Mercer had used 2 years earlier. Her name was Joanna Pike. Downtown Seattle office. Precise voice. No unnecessary softness. She got me in at 11:30 because I said the words potential property, encumbrance, and school-age children in the same sentence. And apparently, the law still recognizes emergency when money threatens shelter. Her office smelled like paper, lemon cleaner, and expensive caution. Joanna wore a charcoal suit and no wedding ring. She listened without interrupting while I explained the alert, the folder, the shift in Daniel over the last 6 months. More dinners out that turned into client development. More private calls taken in the garage. More sudden concern about simplifying our asset structure. The way he had started talking about the house, not as our home, but as an instrument, an option, a vehicle. When I finished, Joanna folded her hands and asked, "Do you believe your husband has already retained counsel?" "Yes." "Do you believe he's preparing to file for divorce?" "Yes." "Do you believe he intends to reposition marital assets before formal disclosure?" I looked at the framed degree behind her shoulder, then back at her. "Yes." She nodded once, like I had passed a test no wife wanted to take. "Then let him file first." I blinked. "What?" "Let him show his hand first," she said. People who think first filing gives them leverage often move too fast. They make representations early, sometimes before they've aligned all their facts. If he's hiding debt, moving money, or setting up a claim to the house, the petition and temporary orders request may tell us where he thinks he's strongest. That matters. I had come in ready to be told to race, freeze accounts, serve papers, beat him by hours. Instead, Joanna slid a yellow legal pad toward me and began writing a list. Preserve records, copy statements, pull title history, secure tax returns, change personal passwords, monitor credit, do not tip him off. Then she looked up. You're not powerless because you file second. Sometimes second is where the truth enters the room. I walked out of that office with a consultation agreement in my bag and a feeling I can only describe as sharpened grief. The marriage wasn't just dying. It was becoming administrative. Daniel filed on Friday. He chose the King County Courthouse and had me served at 4:18 p.m., just early enough to wreck the weekend and just late enough to keep me from reaching anyone unprepared. The process server was apologetic, mid-50s, rain jacket, tired eyes. He asked if I was Claire Mercer, and I heard myself answer yes in the same voice I might have used to confirm a grocery pickup. Irretrievable breakdown of marriage. Petition for dissolution. Request for exclusive use of the marital residence pending proceedings. That last line made my vision narrow. Exclusive use. He wasn't just filing. He was going after possession of the house immediately. I sat at the kitchen island while the kids watched a movie upstairs and read the petition twice. Daniel had characterized our marriage as financially unstable due to my impulsive spending and resistance to strategic refinancing. He alleged that his efforts to preserve liquidity had been blocked by my lack of cooperation. He requested temporary control over the residence to stabilize household financial obligations and proposed that I seek alternative accommodation with family due to heightened domestic tension. Alternative accommodation with family, as if my life were a coat he could hang somewhere else until court. He came home at 6:03 carrying sushi like a man bringing peace offerings to a country he'd already invaded. The first thing he said when he saw the papers on the counter was, "I wish it hadn't happened this way." That sentence, more than the filing itself, almost made me laugh, because this way had been engineered. This way had signatures, timing, draft language. This way had probably started months ago. I leaned against the sink and asked, "Were you going to tell me before or after the temporary orders hearing?" He set the takeout bag down slowly. "Claire, I didn't want a scene." "No," I said. "You wanted a tactical advantage." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to do this cleanly. By telling the court I should leave my own house." "Our house," he corrected automatically, then seemed to realize too late that one word had exposed him. He wanted the house when it served him, and distance when it didn't. I said nothing. Silence unsettled Daniel more than anger ever did. Anger let him play reasonable. Silence made him hear himself. He lowered his voice. "Joanna Pike?" It was the first real crack. "You checked," I said. "I assumed." "You assumed, right?" He exhaled through his nose. "Then you know how ugly this can get." I looked at him across the granite island we had argued over in 2017 because he wanted imported stone, and I wanted to stay under budget. I remembered signing contractor checks while he was traveling for work. I remembered breastfeeding our son Owen in the half-finished nursery while paint fumes clung to the hall. I remembered choosing this house because the maple in the front yard turned gold every October, and Daniel had said, hand warm on my back, "We'll grow old here, ugly, as if ugliness had just arrived." "I know exactly how ugly it can get," I said. He slept in the guest room that night. By Monday, Joanna had filed our response and requested reciprocal disclosures, injunctive relief against any borrowing or transfer involving marital assets, and an emergency preservation order as to the residence. She also had a title history pulled. That was when the shape of Daniel's confidence became clearer. 2 months earlier, an LLC had been formed in Washington. Mercer Strategic Holdings, LLC, registered agent, a lawyer in Tacoma. Manager, Daniel Mercer. No mention to me. No business discussion. No marital disclosure. No legitimate reason for a brand new entity to exist unless he planned to route income, debt, or future claims through it. Joanna stared at the printout and said, "He's building compartments." I hated how accurate that sounded. Compartments. Marriage in one box. Money in another. Liability in another. Truth nowhere visible all at once. The temporary hearing was set for 9 days later. 9 days can hold a lifetime when every cabinet in your kitchen feels bugged by memory. Daniel moved through the house like an executive in transition. Polite, clipped, selective. He no longer kissed the children absent-mindedly at breakfast. He performed fatherhood now, asked about homework with witnesses present, loaded the dishwasher with the solemnity of a man building an evidentiary record. He wanted everything documented, except the parts that mattered. Joanna told me not to leave the house voluntarily under any circumstances. Possession creates narrative, she said. If you move out, he argues status quo. He wants you displaced before a judge even sees your face. So I stayed. I slept with my phone under my pillow and my car keys in the top drawer of my nightstand. I made school lunches. I answered Ellie's questions about why Daddy was being weird. I told Owen grown-ups were working through something hard and that nobody was selling the dog. I smiled at teachers, paid the electric bill, downloaded statements after midnight. Every day split into 2 tracks, visible motherhood and invisible triage. Then Marisol called with the kind of update that changes the temperature in your blood. I think I saw Daniel, she said, at lunch in Kirkland with Vanessa Grome. The name landed heavily because I knew it. Vanessa worked in private banking, not retail, not the branch kind. Structured lending, high net worth clients, risk packaging. I'm not sure, Marisol added, but if it was her, they weren't on a date. No, of course not. They were planning. Joanna moved fast. She subpoenaed preliminary lending communications connected to the HELOC inquiry and demanded production of all business formation documents, account statements, and communications regarding Mercer Strategic Holdings. Daniel's lawyer objected to everything, with the speed of a man billing by the breath. The hearing came on a rain-bright Thursday, King County Superior Court. Gray carpet, bad acoustics, men in blue suits pretending not to stare at women unraveling in public. Daniel wore a navy tie I had bought him before his cousin's wedding in Boston. Seeing it on him in that courtroom felt obscene, like he had accessorized betrayal with our marriage. His attorney, Malcolm Reed, was younger than I expected and smoother. He argued that Daniel had been the primary earner, primary mortgage payer, and more stable presence for the children. He framed me as emotionally volatile and financially obstructive. He said Daniel sought exclusive use of the house, only to maintain continuity. Continuity, a fascinating word for eviction by litigation. Joanna stood and dismantled him line by line. Joint title, joint occupancy, no evidence of instability by me. Evidence instead of concealed borrowing efforts and undisclosed entity formation by Daniel. Risk to marital estate. Need for preservation, not displacement. Then she introduced the one point Daniel clearly hadn't expected her to raise that early. Your Honor, she said, we have reason to believe Mr. Mercer has been exploring debt secured by the marital residence while simultaneously preparing an undisclosed business vehicle. We are not asking the court to reward whichever party sprinted to the clerk's office first. We are asking the court to prevent unilateral asset manipulation. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and the expression of someone permanently unimpressed by male certainty, turned toward Daniel. Mr. Mercer, she said, have you applied for or pursued any borrowing secured by the residence without your spouse's express knowledge? His face barely moved, but I saw it, a flicker, a microsecond of recalculation. No, Your Honor, he said. Not exactly a lie, not exactly the truth. The judge denied his request for exclusive use, ordered neither party to encumber, transfer, or materially alter any marital asset, required expedited disclosure, set a case schedule. No one won that day in the cinematic sense. No gasp, no collapse, no immediate justice. But when we stepped into the hallway, Daniel didn't look like a man leading anymore. He looked irritated, and irritated men make mistakes. The first real mistake arrived through disclosure. Daniel produced account summaries that were too clean. That sounds ridiculous unless you've ever compared honest finances to curated ones. Honest finances are messy. Grocery stores, gas stations, school activity fees, random pharmacy charges, streaming subscriptions, dog groomer, HVAC repair. Real life has fingerprints. Daniel's disclosures looked ironed, large transfers listed without corresponding origin detail. Consulting income reported in rounded numbers. Business expenses grouped broadly enough to hide anything. Mercer Strategic Holdings shown as inactive development entity. There was no complete operating agreement, no full ledger, no explanation for a $38,000 transfer out of one of his personal accounts into an account ending in 1147 that he claimed was temporary reserve positioning. Temporary reserve positioning was not a thing. It was a phrase built to survive cross-examination from someone less irritated than Joanna Pike. We sat in her office on a Monday afternoon while rain streaked the windows, and she tapped the statements with a capped pen. "He's floating money between containers," she said, "and he assumes broad labels will slow us down. Can he do that? He can try." The next escalation came through the children. That is how men like Daniel regain confidence when legal pressure starts tightening around money. They move the conflict toward emotion because emotion blurs evidence. He began texting about parenting with unnatural frequency. "You were 5 minutes late to pick up. Ellie says you seemed upset. Owen needs stability. Maybe we should consider temporary nesting arrangements for the kids." Nesting, another polished term. In practice, it meant the children stayed in the house while we rotated in and out like divorced tenants. Impossible financially, convenient strategically. If I agreed, Daniel could argue I had effectively accepted separation from the residence. Joanna told me not to touch it. Then he started showing up early to school events he normally forgot. Smiling at teachers, bringing orange slices to soccer, telling the coach he wanted whatever was least disruptive for the kids. He was building witnesses, and because the performance included actual involvement, it worked on people who didn't know his history. One evening, Ellie asked, "Why is Dad suddenly at everything?" I was folding towels in the family room. She sat cross-legged on the rug, 4th grade math worksheet open, pencil tucked behind one ear. I chose my words carefully. Sometimes when adults realize they might lose something important, they act differently. She looked up. Are we the important thing? There are questions children ask that should come with advance warning and oxygen. "You always were," I said. The problem was, I wasn't sure we were the thing Daniel feared losing most. I thought it was the house. Then I found the tax returns, not the ones in our family Dropbox. Those had already been curated. The real copies were in a banker's box in the garage behind a broken leaf blower and a rolled-up extension cord. I found them because Daniel never did garage work himself, and therefore always hid things in places he considered beneath scrutiny. Schedules were missing from the digital versions, K1 references, pass-through activity, depreciation entries tied to an entity I had never heard of. Pine Harbor Renovation Partners. I sat on the garage floor in my coat with cold concrete under my legs and read line items until the air felt thin. Daniel had an interest, maybe direct, maybe indirect, in something tied to property investment or redevelopment, and he had never disclosed it inside the marriage except through tax architecture I was never meant to study. I called Joanna from the garage. She was silent for 3 seconds after I read the name. Then, bring me everything. The forensic accountant entered our lives that week. His name was Eric Lutz, compact, restless, wireframe glasses. The kind of man who seemed socially optional but numerically divine. He reviewed the returns, statements, entity records, and preliminary disclosures while drinking terrible office coffee and occasionally muttering to himself like a mechanic, listening to an engine problem others couldn't hear. After 3 hours, he leaned back and said, "Your husband isn't just hiding money, he's timing liability." Joanna looked at him. "Explain." He pointed to the Pine Harbor entries, then to Mercer Strategic Holdings. "Whatever he's doing, I don't think the LLC was built to hide profits alone. I think it was built to absorb fallout." "From what?" Eric tapped a transfer schedule. "There's a bridge arrangement here, or the start of one. Possible personal guarantee exposure, maybe tied to a failed property deal. He may have needed access to the home's equity not for a new opportunity, but because an old one is bleeding. That changed everything. Until then, I believed Daniel was trying to take the house because it was valuable. Now another possibility surfaced. He needed the house because something else was collapsing. When you live with someone for 13 years, revelation rarely arrives as a clean break. It arrives as a rearrangement of old memories into a shape that finally makes sense. Suddenly, the late-night calls weren't ambition. They were damage control. The mood swings weren't stress. They were fear. The sudden insistence that I was too emotional to discuss money wasn't impatience. It was containment. He wasn't planning a better future. He was trying to survive a financial wreck without letting me see the smoke. Joanna moved to compel full production. Daniel's counsel fought, delayed, objected, reframed, standard. But the court ordered supplemental disclosures within 10 days. Daniel complied just enough to pretend cooperation, enough to give us 3 more boxes and 2 more lies. The biggest lie came disguised as concession. He offered settlement, not full settlement, temporary, house-related. He proposed that I remain in the residence with the children temporarily if I agreed to a stipulated refinance framework in which, upon final dissolution, he would retain a 58% equity position in recognition of his disproportionate contribution to principal reduction and risk assumption. Risk assumption. There it was again, a phrase carrying more than it admitted. He wanted me to sign an agreement that memorialized his greater claim to the house before full asset tracing, before debt exposure became visible, before I knew what risk he had actually assumed. Joanna didn't even let the paper fully land on her desk before saying, "Absolutely not." I took the proposal home anyway and read it at the kitchen counter after midnight, while the refrigerator hummed and the dishwasher dried, the last evidence of family dinner. There was language in paragraph 12 about cooperation with any lender-selected title requirements. Paragraph 16 referenced existing related obligations known to the parties. Known to the parties, not known to me. He was trying to manufacture my knowledge retroactively. The next morning I handed the paper back to Joanna. She smiled without warmth. "Good. You saw it." "What exactly is he trying to do?" "Best case," she said. "Anchor an inflated equity claim before the real books open. Worst case. Get you to sign language that later lets him argue you knew about outside obligations attached to his business dealings." I thought of Daniel in our kitchen saying he wanted this cleanly, as if cleanliness and concealment were cousins. Discovery widened. Eric traced one set of transfers to a regional bank in Tacoma, tied not to Mercer Strategic Holdings directly, but to Pine Harbor Renovation Partners, through a chain of deposits and guaranteed draws. Daniel had signed at least one personal guarantee 18 months earlier, maybe more. The project appeared to involve a redevelopment parcel near Gig Harbor that stalled after permit disputes and contractor litigation. There were hints of cost overruns, unpaid invoices, and a looming deficiency. I stared at the summary Eric prepared and felt heat crawl up my neck. You're telling me he may have tried to borrow against our house to cover a failing investment he never told me about? Eric adjusted his glasses. That's my working theory. And if he couldn't borrow, he files first, seeks control of the residence, positions you as unstable, pushes settlement, maybe gets you to sign around disclosure, maybe forces sale, maybe extracts cash out through court pressure. Joanna finished the thought. Before the creditors arrive. There it was. Not divorce as ending, divorce as firewall. The cruelty of that realization didn't come from the money, not entirely. It came from the design. Daniel had not merely decided to leave me. He had apparently planned to use the legal destruction of our marriage as a mechanism for shielding himself from consequences he had earned elsewhere. I drove home in a freezing drizzle and sat in the driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. The house glowed warm from within. Ellie had taped paper snowflakes to the front side light. Owen's rain boots were upside down by the bench. Through the living room window, I could see Daniel helping with homework at the dining table, his head bent toward our son in a posture so tender it almost convinced me of him for half a second. Then he looked up and saw me through the glass, and the look in his eyes was not tenderness. It was calculation interrupted. He met me in the mudroom after the kids ran upstairs. "You've been very busy," he said. "So have you." He crossed his arms. "If you're digging into business matters you don't understand, you're going to make this harder than it needs to be." That sentence, cold and familiar, was his true voice. Not shouting, not cursing, just a smooth reduction of me. Years of marriage had taught him the pressure points. He knew that being underestimated had been one of my oldest wounds, not because I was weak, but because I was calm. Quiet women are often mistaken for uninformed women. I hung my coat. Then explain it. There's nothing to explain. Pine Harbor. His expression shifted so subtly, most people would have missed it. I didn't. Tax paperwork, he said. Minor position. Nothing material. Material enough to risk our house. He stepped closer. You need to stop talking to half-informed professionals who get paid to scare people. And you need to stop treating fraud like formatting. That landed. His eyes hardened. "Be careful, Claire." "Why?" I asked. "Because the truth sounds dramatic when you're used to controlling the script?" For one wild second, I thought he might actually say it all. Confess. Break. Tell me he was drowning and had panicked and didn't know how to back out. There are moments when even the cruelest people seem almost human from the right angle. Then he straightened his cuffs. "I filed first for a reason," he said quietly. "You should think about that." It was meant as a threat. Instead, it became confirmation. He still believed first filing meant first power, which meant he still didn't understand what Joanna had understood in the first 30 minutes. People who rush to court before aligning their lies create records, and records can be read. The major twist began with an envelope from a title insurer and a voicemail from a man named Scott Duvall. He represented a subcontractor on the Pine Harbor project. He had found my name through public title records connected to the Mercer residence and wanted to confirm whether I had signed any consent relating to a collateral support package issued the previous year. I listened to the voicemail 3 times. Collateral support package. Previous year. I had signed no such thing. Joanna called him back with me in the room. He was careful but direct. His client, a framing subcontractor, had not been paid in full after the Pine Harbor redevelopment stalled. During settlement discussions among creditors and insurers, A packet of support documents had surfaced that referenced Daniel Mercer's personal guarantee and spousal acknowledgment of residential asset context. Spousal acknowledgement, residential asset context. The language itself sounded contaminated. Joanna's voice went flat. "Send us the packet." He did. It arrived by secure email 17 minutes later. There, buried in scanned PDFs full of lender jargon and signature blocks, was my name, Claire Elise Mercer, typed beneath a signature that resembled mine only from a distance. The way a forged smile resembles happiness. The document was not a deed, not a mortgage, not a full guarantee. It was, in some ways, worse. A notarized acknowledgment stating that I had been advised of Daniel's participation in Pine Harbor Renovation Partners, understood that personal financial resources, including marital residential equity, could be implicated in support arrangements, and had no objection to Daniel's use of jointly held financial profile information in connection with ongoing project obligations. I felt my body go cold from the spine outward. He hadn't just hidden the deal. He had fabricated my awareness of it. Joanna read the notary page, then looked up sharply. "Where were you on April 14th last year?" I thought. School fundraiser, Thursday, silent auction. I had chaired the dessert table and worn a green sweater because Ellie spilled frosting on the black one before we left. "I was at St. Matthew's from 6 to 9, I said. Joanna nodded. "Then unless you signed this between cupcake raffles and teleported to Tacoma, we have a problem for him." The notary stamp came from Pierce County, 7:48 p.m., April 14th. The idea that Daniel had not merely concealed debt, but manufactured my consent to potential residential exposure did something clean and terrible inside me. Fear ended. Not anxiety, not grief. Those stayed, but fear ended. Because there is a strange kind of relief in discovering the floor really is as rotten as it felt. Once the hidden damage is visible, you stop wasting energy pretending it might still hold. Joanna amended strategy immediately. No more cautious waiting. She filed for sanctions, emergency relief, and forensic document examination. She notified Daniel's counsel that we had evidence of a potentially forged spousal acknowledgment tied to undeclared business obligations and reserved all civil and criminal remedies. The language of her letter was so precise, it practically drew blood. Daniel called me 16 times that evening. I answered on the 17th. "Don't do this," he said without greeting. I stood in the pantry with the door half closed, while pasta boiled on the stove, and the kids argued over a blue bowl. "You mean, discover what you did? You don't understand the context. Then explain the fake signature." Silence. Then, "It wasn't like that." That sentence is the anthem of guilty men. Never denial with structure, never truth. Just a vague appeal to complexity, as if details will somehow redeem intention. I said, "Did you forge my name?" His voice dropped. The lender needed acknowledgement language. It wasn't a transfer. It wasn't supposed to be used the way it's being used now. There it was. Not only did he admit it in substance, he defended it as procedural necessity. My knees felt weak, but my voice didn't shake. "You forged my name on a notarized document tied to our house. It didn't touch the house. Then why mention residential equity? It was standard positioning. Stop saying fake business nonsense and answer me like a human being." He inhaled hard. I was trying to keep everything afloat. Everything. Meaning himself, not us. "I have dinner on the stove," I said, and hung up. From that moment, Daniel's posture changed from like confident aggressor to cornered negotiator. He no longer talked about continuity or stability. He talked about proportional resolution, practicality, avoiding mutual destruction. He sent through settlement feelers so fast they practically smoked. He would waive certain equity claims. He would accept a structured buyout. He would agree to nesting. He would agree to sale. He would agree to binding mediation. He would agree to almost anything except full public illumination. Because illumination was now the threat. The document examiner confirmed what Joanna already suspected. The signature was highly likely not mine. The notarization itself raised serious irregularity questions. Scott Duvall's client provided additional correspondence showing Daniel had represented, "My wife has reviewed and acknowledged the support structure in emails months before filing for divorce. Emails, dates, attachments, timestamps." The truth was no longer a feeling. It was a stack. At 70% of the story, maybe more. This is where people imagine vindication arrives cleanly. It doesn't. It arrives with nausea, with headaches, with the terrible awareness that every revelation capable of saving you also proves how deliberately you were endangered. Daniel's creditors had not yet formally reached the residence, but they were circling. Pine Harbor was in deeper trouble than Eric first estimated. Cost overruns had become claims. Claims had become litigation. One lender appeared to be evaluating recovery avenues tied to guarantors. Daniel's sprint into divorce court now looked exactly like what it was. A preemptive attempt to reposition the marital home, force my displacement, and create leverage before exposure widened. Joanna sought an order awarding me temporary exclusive use of the residence now. Not because I had wanted that war, but because Daniel's conduct had made joint occupancy legally absurd. We argued fraud risk, document manipulation, pressure tactics, and the children's need for continuity under the care of the parent, not using the house as collateral theater. The hearing was set fast because courts move quicker when forgery enters the chat. Daniel looked worse that morning. Not ruined. Men like him don't ruin outwardly until much later. But his grooming had slipped half an inch, tie slightly off, under-eye shadows, irritation where polish used to be. Malcolm Reed tried to contain the blast radius. He argued misunderstanding, informal project paperwork, overstatement by third parties, no actual encumbrance recorded against the home, and the dangers of litigating business collateral issues inside family court. Joanna stood, calm as winter. "Your Honor, Mr. Mercer wants the benefit of concealment and the shelter of technicality. He wants to say the house was not formally encumbered, so his spouse should ignore the forged acknowledgment that positioned her awareness of residential exposure. He wants to say the fire never reached the walls, so the family should keep living beside the gasoline. That is not how preservation works." Then she introduced the emails, then the document report, then the timeline showing he formed Mercer Strategic Holdings before filing and pursued control of the residence while withholding the Pine Harbor exposure. The judge's face changed very little, but when judges get quieter, you should worry more. She granted me temporary, exclusive use of the residence, granted Daniel parenting time on a structured schedule, ordered immediate turnover of additional business records, warned both counsel that any further evidence of document fabrication or concealment would trigger referral considerations outside family court. Outside family court. That phrase rang like metal. Daniel did not look at me when we stepped into the hallway. He spoke only to Malcolm in a harsh whisper that made Malcolm's shoulders rise defensively. Then he left by the far staircase instead of the elevator, like proximity to ordinary people had become dangerous. I drove home across the lake with both hands gripping the wheel so hard my wrists hurt. November light lay silver on the water. Seattle looked distant and expensive and indifferent. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt exhausted enough to disappear. Because power reversal in real life is not applause. It is administrative custody of the battlefield. Still, something fundamental had shifted. For months, maybe longer, Daniel had operated on the assumption that I was the softer structure, the easier pressure point, the spouse who could be moved, delayed, confused, talked over, strategically saddened into compromise. Now he was out of the house, and I was standing in the kitchen he had tried to litigate me out of, listening to my children laugh in the den, while a court order with my name on it sat on the counter beside a bowl of clementines. He came for his first scheduled pickup that Friday at 5 p.m. The sheriff's office was not there. The neighbors were not watching theatrically from behind curtains. Nothing cinematic happened. Daniel parked at the curb, walked up the path, and stood on the porch like a guest at a home he used to own in theory. When I opened the door, he looked past me instinctively, scanning the entryway, the staircase, the family photos on the hall table, looking for evidence of erasure. There wasn't any. That was the point. I had not torn his face from pictures in a rage, had not boxed his suits and left them in rain, had not repainted the bedroom. I did not need destruction to prove control. The house looked exactly like a home, which meant it now looked nothing like his strategy. Ellie ran down first with her backpack and stuffed rabbit. Owen followed, dragging his duffel in that lopsided way children do when they're half muscle, half momentum. Daniel crouched to hug them, voice warm, eyes damp on command. Maybe some of that feeling was real. I no longer tried to sort the genuine from the useful in him. The result had been the same either way. He stood again. "Can we talk for a second?" I shook my head once, not without counsel. His mouth tightened. "Claire, no." The kids were already heading toward the car. He lowered his voice. "You're making this uglier." That almost made me smile. The oldest trick in the book: accuse the person naming the damage of causing it. I said, "You forged my name." He looked at the porch boards. For the first time in 13 years, Daniel Mercer looked like a man forced to stand next to the size of his own choices without lighting or language to help him. Then he said very quietly, "I never thought you'd push this far." There are sentences that explain a whole marriage at once. Not "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong." I never thought you'd push this far. Meaning, I never thought you would defend yourself beyond the point where my comfort ended. Meaning, I believed your decency had no edge. Meaning, I built my plan around your reluctance to make me answer for what I did. I stepped back and held the door. "You should go," I said. The final power reversal did not happen in court, though court made it possible. It happened over the next 6 weeks in small, irreversible transfers of authority. Daniel agreed to a global settlement structure. After Joanna signaled, we were prepared to litigate both the dissolution and the related fraud issues aggressively and publicly. His equity position in the house shrank dramatically once real debt exposure, concealment, and misconduct entered the spreadsheet. Pine Harbor's collapse made his liquidity arguments evaporate. He could not credibly claim superior financial stewardship while standing on forged acknowledgments and hidden guarantees. We negotiated a buyout mechanism based on actual, traceable marital equity, not his fantasy percentage. He waived claims he once called non-negotiable. Parenting plans were restructured around the children's routines, not his optics. Separate civil issues remained reserved, which meant he did not get the comfort of total closure. He got consequence in installments. Mercer Strategic Holdings, functionally useless now. A shell revealed too early, a compartment with no oxygen. The lender side noise around Pine Harbor got louder. Scott Duvall's world and Joanna's world were not the same. But they touched enough for Daniel to understand that family court had not been the only room in which his paperwork would be discussed. That knowledge changed his posture more than any judicial lecture ever could. By Christmas, the house lights were up. Not because I suddenly became festive, because Ellie asked if we were still doing white lights along the porch rail, and Owen wanted the inflatable snowman, even though I hated it. And I realized the most radical thing I could do was maintain ordinary joy inside a structure someone else had tried to turn into leverage. I stood on the front walk one freezing evening while the kids argued about extension cords and the maple tree in the yard through black branches across the violet sky. The porch glowed warm. Music drifted faintly from inside. My phone buzzed with an email from Joanna. Updated draft settlement, final revisions minor. Looking good. Looking good. Such a small phrase for a mountain crossed. Marisol came by with mulled cider and stood beside me in her boots. "You look different," she said. I laughed softly. Older? Sharper. That was true. Not harder in the dead sense. Not closed, not bitter. Just sharpened. Like something honed by being dragged repeatedly across the wrong surface and surviving it anyway. I thought back to the day Joanna told me to let him file first. At the time, it sounded passive, almost naive, as if patience were surrender in nicer clothes. Now I understood. Letting him file first had never been about yielding ground. It had been about allowing velocity to expose intention. Daniel needed to move before I did, because his whole plan depended on surprise, on my confusion, on the old marital reflex that said if he sounded sure, he probably knew best. He needed me reacting while he arranged nouns around me. Unstable, obstructive, emotional, impractical, displaced. Instead, I watched, I collected, I answered in records. And when his story finally opened under its own pressure, it did what false structures always do. It collapsed from the inside. That New Year's Day, the house was quiet for the first hour after sunrise. The kids were still asleep in a tangle of blankets and new pajamas. The dog snored by the radiator. I made coffee and stood alone in the kitchen. My kitchen. The sky outside, pale blue with frost clinging to the fence. On the counter beside the fruit bowl sat the latest settlement draft and a yellow sticky note in Joanna's handwriting from the day before. He overplayed first position. I smiled when I read it again, because that was the whole story. He thought first meant ahead, first to file, first to frame, first to strike, first to define the marriage's ending. But first is only powerful when the truth arrives second and weaker. In this case, truth arrived second and armed. I let him file first because he was always going to. Because men like Daniel cannot resist the seduction of appearing one step ahead. Because he mistook speed for control. Because he thought a petition could outrun a paper trail. Because he believed the person who introduces the war gets to write the history. He was wrong. And in the end, that house on Alder Ridge Drive stayed what it had always been when stripped of his language and fear and planning. Not an instrument, not a bargaining chip, not a shield against creditors. Home. Mine because I fought for it in the only way that mattered. Not with volume, not with panic, not with the fantasy of being unbreakable, but with patience sharp enough to let a lie keep talking until it named itself. So yes, I let him file first, and that was how I won.